Dr. Graham and Mr. Evers, are you with us?
We are. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, we can hear you.
Wonderful.
Ron, go ahead.
Good morning, Co-Chairman Marshall, Co-Chairman Thane, members of the Idaho Content Standards Committee. Thank you for giving your time and attention to this important subject today. I'm Graham Walker. I'm the Executive Director of the Independent Institute. We are a nonpartisan publishing and research organization. Over the past 34 years, we have published dozens of books in our peer-reviewed quarterly journal, all on public policy issues and analysis. And we have a long-standing interest in educational policy. So as a result, we watched with interest as Florida developed its new standards aiming to transcend the Common Core. And of course, we were aware of the criticism received after Florida made its results public in English language and mathematics, including criticism from the Thomas Fordham Institute. So we wanted to really think about it fresh because we knew it mattered. So we invited 4 scholars to take a deep dive into Florida's English language and mathematics standards. And the scholars we invited were David Steiner, Professor of Education at Johns Hopkins, Ashley Rogers Berner, also Associate Professor of Education at Johns Hopkins. Both of them lead the Johns Hopkins University Institute for Education Policy. Also, James Milgram, who is an Emeritus Professor of Mathematics at Stanford, previously served on the National Board for Education Sciences and on the NASA Advisory Council. And the study was coordinated by Zev Werman, who was formerly a senior policy advisor with the Office of Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development at the U.S. Department of Education. All of them are careful students of curricular issues, including Common Core. 2 of them had been proponents of Common Core standards. And as a result, they worked on it and they produced a careful analysis of the English language and math standards in Florida and published a briefing available on our website, which we titled Better Than Common Core. You can look at it here at your leisure when you have a chance. Better Than Common Core, Florida's new K-12 standards raise the bar. So we welcomed their results and published them. And in brief, what they found was that Florida's BEST standards are actually better on a number of counts than Common Core. They're user-friendly, clear, has learning outcomes rather than not just inputs, emphasizing the content expected of the learners in a very clear way, and doing so in a way that belies any criticism that Florida rushed in preparing its standards or cut any corners. Our evaluators found the new Florida BES standards to be a truly creditable set of standards. And to us, it was clear that these new Florida standards could well be of use to Idaho and other states. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, for details on this, let me turn to my colleague, Dr. Williamson M. Evers. Dr. Evers is the director of our Center on Educational Excellence. He is formerly of the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He is a longtime curricular expert, and he can provide you with details. So with your permission, Mr. Co-Chairman, I will turn to Dr. Evers. And Dr. Evers, if you will unmute your mic and offer your comments, I think that they are ready to hear your somewhat more detailed comments on the Florida BES standards. Dr. Evers.
Thank you. Dr. Evers, go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Walker, and thank you, co-chairs, Senator Thane and Representative Marshall, and members of the Content Standards Committee for having us. I just wanted to explain a little further. I came to Idaho some years ago at the invitation of the Albertson Foundation, and among other things, I met with the late Marilyn Howard. I've also had dealings with Tom Luna during the George W. Bush administration, and also when I was an advisor during the Bush administration, when I was an advisor to the campaign, and also when I was U.S. Assistant Secretary of Education for Policy. And I also had dealings with Tom Luna during the Trump-Pence transition when I was heading the review of the U.S. Department of Education. I wanted to, and I served in California on the Academic Standards Commission that reviewed the Common Core. And you heard Mike Petrilli praise highly the work that we did expanding on math in the later grades, and I was part of that whole process. So I've been working hands-on on standards setting and review since 1997. It's essentially the same 20 plus years that the Fordham Institute has been working on this. So I wanted to start by giving some sense of some deficiencies in the Common Core. So in English, the Common Core emphasizes skills and mechanics at the expense of substance. Just to give you some sort of odd examples, there's a mistake having to do with long and short vowels in reading instruction in the Common Core. It got in there. The people writing it realized it, but it was too late. It had already been adopted by 30 states in that form, and the group that was in charge on modifying it essentially liquidated itself. So that's still in there. They have an odd reluctance to look at substance and context and meaning. So take the Gettysburg Address. The perpetrators, the proponents, the creators of the Common Core want the Gettysburg Address studied completely out of context. They suggest that students write an essay about the Common Core, looking at the words alone, and having no knowledge of the historical context. And they want them to be judged on three main ideas, graded or according to a rubric that looks for keywords, organization, and the repetition of these key ideas. This is a crazy formalistic approach. So people shied away from this. In math, as one of your committee members pointed out, there are all these multiple approaches, multiple convoluted, roundabout methods of math problem solving, and multiple approaches. This is because there's sort of two ways to understand conceptual understanding. Both sides want conceptual understanding. But one side believes you have to have conceptual understanding before you can do the computation. And they believe that really the only way you can have conceptual understanding is if you have 4 or 5 different ways to address the same problem. And the side that I would associate myself with believes that you learn the algorithm, the standard algorithm, you learn why that works and how that works, but you learn it interwoven with learning the math. The error that we see in Common Core is that the children are verbalizing and writing little essays, but unable to do the math operation and unable to do it with any automaticity. Our testimony from Mike Petrilli emphasized at several points doing math procedures to automaticity, such as addition and subtraction facts, such as the multiplication tables. Amazingly enough, Common Core does not have automaticity in it. Yes, it talks about these things, but it doesn't demand that the students learn these things to automaticity. So just to go over a few other things that are missing in Common Core, you don't find conversion back and forth between percentages, decimals, and fractions. You don't find least common denominator. You don't find the formula and understanding of compound interest. They're behind in teaching various things. They don't teach decimals until the 4th grade, whereas high achieving countries do it much earlier, 2 years earlier. They don't teach key geometric concepts such as sum of angles in a triangle, isosceles, and equilateral triangles. Again, these are not taught until things like 8th grade or high school, whereas other countries that are high performing teach them earlier. So it has all these deficiencies. So this is what drove parents, teachers mad, also led states like Florida to try something better and different. So our reviewers, and I would add one other thing about David Steiner, and that is that he's on the Maryland State Board of Education currently, and he's the previous commissioner of the entire state of New York. So this is a man who he's always had a knowledge-focused approach to standards. He thought he could work within the framework of the Common Core. But when he came to Florida, he realized that the new Florida standards were vastly better and it would be a better basis. So the ELA team that was headed by Steiner found that the Florida standards were the strongest standards in ELA currently in use in the United States. And that if they were somewhat tweaked, they could stand as a new model for the country. Very strong. In math, the reviewer, Jim Milgram, one of the most important research mathematicians in the United States, said that the best standards were exemplary and among the best he has ever reviewed for any state in the country. So this is pretty powerful stuff. Now, I think to just add some background to all of this, in Florida, the state needed these standards. It had weak standards in the Sunshine State standards. It went to Common Core. It had trouble under the Jeb Bush administration getting the political capital to improve standards on their own. And so it sort of imported Common Core as a way to try to change the standards. So every state's in its own situation, and Florida was ready to move on. I want to situate Idaho in terms of achievement in Idaho. So nationally, since Common Core came into the fore, NAEP scores have been on the decline. Idaho's scores are currently not on the trajectory to climb up to the level of Massachusetts. Dr. Walker, could you put up? Yes. So Florida has not. Idaho is not on the trajectory to go to the level of Massachusetts, which is the highest performing state. Idaho has the same standards as the other Common Core states, essentially, and over the long run, those scores are going downhill, and Idaho should not expect to be an exception. Currently, Idaho might have a somewhat optimistic view of where it stands nationally in rankings, but if I may use a mining metaphor, I think this is sort of fool's gold, and you have to break down the Idaho numbers a bit. Much of Idaho's relatively high ranking is due to its overwhelmingly white population, around 75%, and small Latino population, about 18%. When one disaggregates the NAEP data by race, it turns out that Idaho's relatively high national ranking, varying between 10 and 16, depends on the grade in the subject, reading or math, but it disappears. Among white students, Idaho ranks generally in the bottom half, 33 in math in fourth grade and 31 in reading in fourth grade. Among Hispanic students, Idaho ranks 26th in math in fourth grade and 37 in reading in grade 8. In grade 8 math, 37 in the country, and in grade 8 reading, 35 in the country. In other words, Idaho is giving mediocre learning to its white population, and it's serving its Latino population poorly. So I think you can do better, and I think you should look to what you can get with Florida. I think it would be a mistake to go with Texas and Idaho. One of our reviewers, Sav Vorman, looked at the Texas standards in math, and he was not impressed. They were too similar to Common Core. Indiana actually made Common Core worse. It's hard to believe. So I do not think you should look at that. I think you should use Florida as a basis. Some have suggested California and Massachusetts. I know California thoroughly since I served on the Standards Commission that reviewed the Common Core and supplemented it in 2010. And these are essentially Common Core standards in both Massachusetts and California. If you adopt Common Core, if you get rid of Common Core and go with Florida as a basis of your standards, you can use the same testing company that Florida does, and they will have item bank that has test items that can be used in Florida. You can also look at textbooks. Florida is a huge market. There will be textbooks that are ready for Florida use, and you can use them. And you go through a regular cycle of adopting textbooks anyway, so it's not any kind of new thing to purchase new textbooks or teaching materials. As far as teacher training goes, yes, there's always teacher training, professional development that's going on. But one of the advantages of the Common Core standards, and one of the things that Jim Milgram, the math reviewer, pointed out, is they are so clear. They're not only written clearly, but then they have clarifications on top of that make it crystal clear. So teachers are not, so a later speaker is Dr. Gary Martin. And he had written a book on decoding the Common Core. You don't need to decode the Florida standards. Just as a parenthetical side thought, Dr. Martin, you should bear in mind and listen to him that his book on the Common Core mathematics guidebook will lose sales if states. He has a kind of conflict of interest. So if states are giving up Common Core, his book that he's co-authored won't have as many purchasers. But all that aside, getting back to this, you can take Florida as the basis of your work, and I think you'll be better off. So I think at this point, I think it would be useful to start doing questions. I think we have a reason for Idaho to look to something better, which Florida can constitute the basis of. And I think we can see that Florida had very strong standards despite, I mean, there's one thing to bear in mind also is that the Fordham Foundation has been paid $7 million by the Gates Foundation that created the Common Core to promote the Common Core. So you should bear that in mind when you hear their pro-Common Core testimony. We have received no money from any outside source. Obviously, that includes we did not receive any money from the state of Florida to give them a favorable review. Our reviewers were objectively expert in this, and I think it's a good path to follow. Please, I would look forward to your questions.
Dr. Evers, thank you. Committee members, questions? Chairman Thane.
Thank you. Appreciate the testimony, Dr. Evers. Everyone so far that's been on the Zoom has been, I think, very forthright and frank with us. We appreciate that. So Mr. Petrelli suggested that we take our current standards, which are basically Common Core, and tweak them and make the changes that we want to clarify. With what
my counsel would be the opposite.
Well, let me finish my question. So, with what you've said, it seems like you're suggesting that we take the Florida standards and tweak them.
Yes.
Okay.
Mr. Petrelli.
I wonder also, Dr. Walker, could you put up the second slide of the thing on Idaho's math and English? Yes. So at a certain point, about 3 years over, you can see that's when Common Core starts, and you can see that Idaho is pretty flat and the country is flat or going down. Go ahead, that's fine. Thank you, you can take it off now. So there's room for improvement in Idaho.
Representative Moon.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Mr. Evers, I appreciate the presentation and I appreciate the look of your desk. I had an astronomy professor whose desk looked just like yours and he was brilliant.
It's a
I'd like to bring up the testing cost. I couldn't get an answer from Mr. Petrelli, but I don't know if you have any idea of the testing for the best standards. And I'm not talking about the development. I'm talking about the yearly cost of a test compared to the SBAC in Florida. Is there a savings and is there less time behind the computer on the testing? Do you know, are you able to answer that question?
The most peculiar thing about testing costs is states using the same test have different costs. It's just a very peculiar field. I'm not sure they're all using the same metrics in evaluating what their costs are. I do think if you based your test, your curriculum around Florida's standards, you could use the same item banks that they're going to use, and they'll have a thoroughly professional test. As another thing that's going to happen is as the Smarter Balance test has fewer and fewer states, the costs are going to go up. They're going to have to cover their costs. So whatever price they have now, it's going to go up.
Thank you, Dr. Evers.
Follow up?
Representative Moon.
And Dr. Evers, so this professional standard writers came up, something that we weren't really discussing in our group. Are you familiar with different groups of
Yes.
professional standard
I'm not-
writers?
I know of people that have had bad experience with. I agree completely with the previous two speakers. By the way, I agreed on several things from them. I mean, even though we're on opposite sides of this, I think they also offered some good thoughts. I do think you should have professional standard writers. They can coordinate this and they're going to word it properly. I think you should. I mean, we can try to supply some names to you, but as other people volunteered to. But off the top of my head, I don't really want to recommend anybody. But there are professionals, and I think in general, if you want to do something right, use a professional, but consult heavily with teachers and other stakeholders.
Thank you, Dr. Evers. Representative Kirby.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for this really interesting presentation. So as far as the NAEP goes, Massachusetts is up there, and
yeah,
we're all trying to chase Massachusetts. And they've done quite a bit of work. They did. I don't know if you looked at their recent edition of their standards, but they added a tremendous number of examples to try to provide clarity.
Yeah.
So my question, kind of two-part, if Massachusetts are who we're all chasing, and they've put an amazing amount of time, effort, and resources into the standards, why would we go a long ways away from Massachusetts? And then this, along with that, part of the same question, you said in math that Florida was among the best. Who are the other best, so to speak?
I don't know specific states that Professor Milgram reviewed, so I cannot speak for him in saying what he was specifically referring to. He's also reviewed many foreign countries. As far as Massachusetts goes, it's interesting that they have dipped down, and this has been thoroughly documented by the Pioneer Institute in Boston. They have dipped down since they adopted Common Core. So I don't think, so they have some peculiar features that Idaho or California or Texas doesn't have. They have a strong tradition going back to the Puritan days of focus on schooling. It's part of the Massachusetts culture. Just think of all the hugely famous universities that are gathered in Massachusetts. It's a very, very learning-oriented state, and culture has a lot to do with academic success. So that we just all have to incrementally work our way toward. So I don't favor emulating Massachusetts and sticking with Common Core. I do think they're focused on clarity and their adding of reading lists and things like that were positive contributions. And Florida also has a reading list.
Thank you. Dr. Evers, Representative Amador, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Dr. Evers. Appreciate your testimony. I have one of my former college professors was at the Hoover Institution, so no, that's
And
a place to be.
who was
Victor Davis Hansen.
Victor
My
Davis?
question is, how do you evaluate, and I asked this earlier to Ms. Levesque, how do you evaluate high quality versus low quality standards? And, I mean, is there a ranking of, 1 through 50 of the states? And, can we pick and choose between different states to form the best standards that we can have in Idaho?
So basically, this is done by expert panels, and to some extent, and so you look at what they argue and you compare if more than one expert panel has done this, as in the case of these new Florida standards. You can look at the arguments and examples and possibly benefit from different critiques. So for Common Core, the Fordham Foundation and the American Federation of Teachers did expert reviews of all the standards. And if I were Idaho, I would take the Florida standards and I would take the great standards before Common Core. So those would include Indiana, Massachusetts, Virginia, and California. And I would use those as expert sources to make sure that Florida had what you wanted. And that's how I would do it. Those were always ranked by both Fordham. This is pre-Gates money, Fordham, and the American Federation of Teachers, who particularly were looking for clarity. So they were looking for doability and teachability, naturally given their institutional focus. So I would look at those, and experts are people that know the subject matter, and they also know about the things that have to go into standards. So they have to be understandable, they have to be operational, and that includes testing and writing textbooks and other instructional materials based on these standards. And so people who are experienced in this field know this and can pick it up when they look at the standards.
Thank you, Chairman Thane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know our time is coming to a close on this presenter, but Dr. Evers, you had mentioned that one of the differences between Common Core and Florida was just not inputs, but there were learning outcomes. And if you could talk to that just for a moment, or maybe send me some information why that's important, I think I'd appreciate that.
I may not understand the question. Maybe you should rephrase it.
Florida standards had learning outcomes, not just learning inputs.
Okay. I can have our reviewers try and get to this. There's other great things. I mean, the Common Core has English teachers trying to teach science and math literacy to students. This is wacky. English teachers do not sign up to teach science and math specialized language to students. They should be taught in math class or in science classes. So that Florida, looked at that and said, how crazy is this? And so they disposed of that. And that's not something you want hanging around in Idaho.
Dr. Evers and Dr. Walker, thank you very, very much for taking the time. And
thank you for this opportunity.
I've got one more here.
Thank you, Mr.
Senator
Co-Chair.
Lent, please.
Thank you. I appreciate you letting me kind of slide in here at the end. My question deals with a subject that you just brought up. And I'd like to know your opinion on the relationship between professional development, teacher preparation, and successful standards in the long run, that relationship.
Dr. Evers?
Well, This is a very puzzling problem for everybody who's spending money on education, and people, parents, and parents say, well, why is my kid home? And what is his professional development? Professional development, of course, is on the job teacher training, And the strange thing about professional development is nobody ever holds it accountable. Nobody ever says, does this professional development actually lead to better student outcomes? So it's like a sales job. Okay. So people come to town and they say, I can cure neuritis, neuralgia, whatever. And if they have a good sales pitch, they end up doing this. I think the better your standards are, the clearer they are, the more obvious it is to teachers what is being gotten at, the less professional development you have to do. And I think Common Core required a lot of professional development, and still NAEP scores have gone down. I think teachers are going to be better off with something like the Florida standards. And I think, just be careful of professional development, that you're not getting something that a snake oil salesman is giving you. I think it's kind of a travesty when you think of how much money and how many lost days there are, and no one evaluates whether they're effective. It's all too true of things in education, that people don't evaluate effectiveness.
Dr. Evers, thank you. Again, thanks, Dr. Walker.
Thank you.
Both of you for being with us. We're going to move to our next presenter. Dr. Walker, did you have any last comments you wanted to make?
No, we just very much appreciate being with you. And if I could make one last comment at your invitation here, I wanted to just point out that Dr. Evers had noted these Idaho results here. What was striking to me, Dr. Evers, is that in every case, as we look at these results, there was an improvement in Idaho students' scores until they flattened out around 2007, 2008. And what was the change there? I think you mentioned it in passing.
It's 2010 is Common Core.
Or that's when the flattening out on these curves occurred.
Well, sometimes it's earlier. It's just, you're not seeing some kind of upward trajectory.
Yeah, you're seeing a bit of a plateau. And I thought that was an important a data point, just to make sure it was clear to the committee. But with that, I'll just say thank you very much for having us.